All right, Jens, welcome to another episode of Horror Joy Meet Your Maker. Today we are joined by Stoker Award-winning author Emily C. Hughes. We'll talk a little bit about her book Horror for Weenies, everything you need to know about the films you're too scared to watch. But also we're just going to talk to Emily about horror and joy and, other horror creations that she's been consuming that might bring her joy. So Emily, thank you for joining us, and we'll just start with a question we always do. What do you see as the relationship between horror and joy?
Well, thank you guys so much for having me. In terms of horror and joy, I find a lot of joy in the ability to work through the weird, anxious, fearful parts of my brain in an external setting, in a safe setting. In terms of, the things that bring me joy in terms of movies, fiction, TV, what brings me joy at this point is things I haven't seen before or things I've seen before done in a new way. And I find horror to be a particularly rich breeding ground for that because everyone's trying to kind of push boundaries and, you're operating within a set of genre conventions that are pretty well established at this point. We know what the rules are for vampires. We know what the rules are for zombies. We know what the rules are for haunted houses or serial killers. And now we have this kind of generation of creatives, of writers, of movie makers doing a lot of fun and interesting things with subverting those expectations and those genre conventions. A great example, the first one that jumps to my mind is Stephen Graham Jones and the slasher. He has just taken every slasher convention, every kind of tired cliche from, 80s and 90s slasher movies and turned them all on their head. I mean, the Indian Lake trilogy alone is like everything you thought you knew about the slasher was wrong. Or This Is My Body by Lindsay King Miller, which comes out next month, which is religious horror, possession horror, but totally turned on its head. And that brings me a lot of joy because I really kind of chase that originality of idea, that originality of spirit.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I was imagining this question for you, the joy of horror, as being a complicated one, because the story that you tell in Horror for Weenies is a complicated relationship with horror. It sounds like you kind of wrote this, right, as a way into horror, as somebody that doesn't like being, or didn't at least like being scared. Now you say you love it. Would you give anybody who hasn't heard about Horror for Weenies, which is such a fun book, and I think a really helpful book for a lot of people, would you give them like just a brief synopsis or argument for the book?
Absolutely. So for myself, I was a scaredy-cat kid. I was really sensitive. I was really prone to, jumping out of my skin at the slightest thing, couldn't do haunted hay rides or, Halloween haunted houses or anything like that. I was just way too anxious and keyed up for anything like that. But I did like weird, macabre stories. I think of, John Belair's, those were really formative to me. Even, the sort of like Edward Gorey storybooks and illustrations. And so I always had that vein of, I'm really scared of this, but I'm also really fascinated by it. And when I started to get older, so the story that I tell that opens the book is about my 10th birthday sleepover, where against all advice and logic, we decided to rent Poltergeist from the video store. And none of us slept that night. That was a bad decision. My mother still regrets allowing that to happen. And that really kind of scared me off anything marketed as horror for a good long time, really until adulthood. But I saw what my friends were getting out of it. I saw, my friends being really excited to go see a horror movie. And I was like, okay, there's still something there. And I still wanted to know what was happening. I wanted to know what the appeal was. And so as I got into my 20s and I started working in book publishing and started sort of developing my adult tastes in reading, I found that I was still really gravitating toward those weird, spooky, unsettling stories. And I thought, well, all right, it's time. I got to just dive into this in the fiction world. And actually, the book that really kind of blew it open for me was Bird Box by Josh Malerman. I was working at that publisher at the time, and the editor handed me a manuscript, and I couldn't shut up about it to anyone nearby, even though it wasn't going to come out for another year. And so from there, it kind of opened my eyes to, oh, this is something I love and I get a lot of joy out of. So I pursued horror fiction for many more years, and then I finally kind of got to a point where I was like, okay, I got to give movies another shot. And this time from the perspective of someone who had read and enjoyed a lot of art criticism and a lot of sort of cultural analysis, I was viewing them from that perspective and getting to appreciate things like cinematography tricks and sound design and editing and, framing choices and storytelling choices, but also the joy of just seeing some freaky shit. And so that really brought me to this genre as an adult in a way that I was totally in. And I would start to field questions from friends, saying, hey, is this book going to be too scary for me? Hey, what bothers me? Is this movie okay for me to watch? And I realized that there were a whole huge swaths of people doing the same thing that I had done, which was trying to figure out what was appealing about a particular horror story by going to the Wikipedia synopsis. As anyone who's ever tried to do that knows, it's kind of an exercise in frustration because it's giving you the bare plot outline, like the dry toast of the story structure, but there's no flavor, there's no spice, there's no sauce. And so I thought, well, it's possible to do that. I can relay the plots of these stories to people I know with lots of color and flair and humor, and it gives them a totally different experience. And so that was kind of the genesis of this book, which is, here are 25 of the most important, most influential horror movies between 1960 and 2018, I think is the latest movie in the book, with like full descriptive plot synopses, cultural analysis to help position, why are we still talking about this movie, years or decades later. Some, fun bits of trivia, things like Tony Todd in Candyman holding bees in his mouth for the scene where they crawl out of his mouth and negotiating himself a per sting bonus that netted him like $23,000 on top of his salary. And also suggested reading, because for me, horror fiction was a way back into the genre. And I thought, well, that could hold true for a lot of other people as well. Seeing something on screen is a very different experience than imagining it when you're reading words on a page. And people seem to like it, so I feel good about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned like some of the apparatus that you're offering throughout each movie to like say this at a party. Like, I think that's really cool. I love the speech bubble effects. I think the aesthetics of this book are great. So listeners, like, make sure you go out and get a physical copy. I feel like this would be one of those really great books that sits on your bookshelf that you can pull out now and again to like share with friends, or during the spooky season or this time of the year when it's so darn hot. We're all hoping for spooky season. You can keep it on your like coffee table if you have one and let folks open up to look at it. The iconic moments are great. Some of the lore you mentioned, like I was reading the bit about Rosemary's Baby with Mia Farrow's haircut or something, and how the rumor was Sinatra divorced her for that. But I really like the can't watch it, read these instead, like you just mentioned. I think that's great because there are so many people who just, I can't watch horror. And one of the things we've talked about on the podcast over and over again is how when people think of horror, they tend to think of what we tend to refer to as torture porn, like bodies being destroyed on screen. And that's not all horror. Like, there's plenty of horror that's not that. So I really appreciate what you're doing here with this book. I like in the introduction that you give us some background on like why horror had a tough time getting started in the earlier part of the 20th century. So that history is really fascinating to me too. And then you mentioned like, obviously you had to leave some movies on the cutting room floor, so to speak, where there wasn't space in the book for them. So not to put you on the spot, but to put you on the spot, what is the one that you wish you could have included that you did not?
It's so stupid. I don't even remember why. I talked myself out of including Alien, and I could kick myself. Like, what was I thinking? That or Jaws, which is just simply my heart of hearts, favorite all-time horror movie. But Alien, I don't know. When I compiled the initial list of movies I would want to talk about or include, it was 50 movies. And there was just simply no way to do justice to that in the the page count I had, basically. And some of those cuts were really tough. There were things that, okay, well, I love this movie, but I can't really make the argument that it's super influential or, culturally relevant today. For instance, Event Horizon, which is not a good movie, but it is a great one, if you get my meaning. But, you can't really, I couldn't argue myself out of including things like, the Blair Witch Project, which is so game changing in so many ways, or Scream, which is sort of our meta horror, origin story. But yeah, that thing you said about torture porn. Yeah, when you say horror, usually the people you're talking to, their mind jumps to one thing, and it could be torture porn, or in the fiction world, they think of Stephen King. There's just no getting around that. And Stephen King is wonderful, and what kind of gets derogatorily referred to as torture porn has its uses, even if it's kind of fallen out of fashion. But there's just such a there's just such a range of options within the genre, and people think it's one thing and it's not. And I really truly believe that there is something in this genre for everyone, even the scarediest cat.
I think I have a pretty similar story to yours, in that I think I mean, I've talked about this on the podcast already, but I did not really love horror movies, especially growing up. I did not like them. I would rather watch sports movies and funny movies, but I loved reading horror, right? We've talked about this, Goosebumps to Stephen King and beyond, and we've talked a lot about Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. All of these things have gotten me for as long as I could read fiction. But watching is still. I watched something last night. I watched The Conjuring for the first time. Come at me, folks. I watched Insidious and hated it, so I avoided James Wan movies unfairly, right? The Conjuring was surprisingly patient, but I watched it because I'm writing something on jump scares, which I don't like. I don't like them. They make me feel bad, right? I jump and I'm like, why? I don't like it. So I don't know what I'm doing to myself, why I'm doing this, but was watching this movie, and I was watching it on my phone just so that I could kind of turn it away when I thought that there was a jump scare coming. All that to say is I think your book is helpful, I think, for somebody like me, but the book as a kind of testimony to the power of horror as a genre to do some of the work that is important, but also to create a kind of art. You talked about art criticism. And I think that's really, really incredible that you've come kind of in all of these different ways to horror and kind of seen what horror can do. So the two that you mentioned, Jaws and Alien, we played this game on Horror Joy. Is it horror? And I think there's a question, right, for both of them. So do you think that Jaws, let's start with Jaws. We can leave this question later, but I'm curious if you have an argument for why we should consider Jaws a horror movie. Now, we started with Jaws here. That was one of our first episodes, but you left it out. But why is Jaws a horror movie, do you think?
So it does ride that line of, is it horror, or is it thriller? Is it horror, or is it, an adventure story? And there's trying to define horror is a really slippery kind of venture. And I don't think it's entirely possible. It's honestly, a lot of it is vibes based. But if I had to make an argument for why Jaws is horror, and I do think it is in a kind of spiritual sense, it's that sense of something is here and I am powerless, functionally powerless to protect myself from it, protect my family from it, or stop it without putting myself in grave bodily, at risk of grave bodily harm. And it's that sense of something being pursued or stalked by something bigger and stronger and scarier and toothier than you are. Something that especially, and this is something I think about a lot with regards to sea or ocean horror and space horror, so this connects back to Alien as well, which is that when you're in an environment that humans can't naturally survive in, say underwater or outside of our atmosphere, and you're faced with something that is native to that environment, that is terrifying to me innately. It's like, oh, we're no longer the apex predator. And I think you could also make that same kind of argument for a movie like Predator. But yeah, that is I think it falls in the horror camp for that reason, even if it has, a happy-ish ending.
Yeah, agreed. Alien is, to me, one of the scariest movies that I've ever seen. I'm terrified of space. We talked about this on the podcast. I have no desire to go to space. I don't care if like the world is ending. I will
go down with this ship. Yeah.
Yeah. Like there, and this is like totally off topic, but there was a movie out a couple years ago. I don't remember the name of it, so this is not helpful, where I'm pretty sure George Clooney is like one of the last people left on Earth or something. And he's like, no, I'm not going. I'm going to stay here. But I would be that guy. Like I'm hanging out here. I am not
I'm
going.
Good,
thank you. Yeah. I mean, it's like I've seen what can happen out there, and none of it's good. Like they don't make a lot of space movies where they're like, look, everyone successfully makes it to Mars and it's happily ever after. Like, I mean, even Total Recall, like that's not happy. That's a very
best
bizarre
case scenario.
movie.
You get like a dystopian, technocratic space colony or whatever, and then nobody has a good time there either.
Yeah, like I don't want that.
Right.
That
I don't want.
great.
I don't want to go to Mars if I
So,
have to go with Elon fucking Musk.
Speaking of horror, yeah, absolutely. Ketamine for everyone. But since we're having this conversation, what it makes me think of is how the ways in which film companies, production companies market films, and like certain films, they don't want to be considered horror movies because horror movies, as we've been discussing, get this bad rap. I'm thinking of Silence of the Lambs, for example, which I would say is horror for sure, but is not considered horror. We've already talked about Jaws. We've talked about Alien. I think, you're making compelling arguments for why they're horror. I'm clearly on board. But there are so many movies that the PR folks decide, no, we can't call it horror because that's not serious. It makes money. Like this is something that you were talking about again in the introduction, where cash is king, and cash speaks to like these horror movies make money. So these production companies are going to make horror movies, but there's still something for like cinema where we think about film as art that horror doesn't get that respect, except maybe for the first time, this year with The Substance. We saw that a little bit. Coralie Farget's The Substance, which was super interesting, and I think could verge on what, again, like calling it torture porn, but I think it had a purpose here, whereas it wasn't like the Rube Goldberg machine of just destroying bodies along the way. So like, as someone who has put together a book now, like kind of making the argument for why horror movies are cool, why they are art in their way, how do we... I don't know that it's our job necessarily to rehabilitate horror, although I think your book is doing a phenomenal first step for a lot of people. But like, how do we as a society recognize that there is so much joy in horror and stop thinking of it in these ways that it's less than?
Well, I mean, the first thing that comes to my mind is Sinners, right? Sinners made something like $500 million after the studio was like, we don't really know how to market this, and we're going to kind of undersell it. And then it turned out to be one of the best reviewed and highest grossing movies of the year so far. Same with 28 Years Later. Same with, Nosferatu at the end of last year. You can't argue with the results. No matter how squirrely the studio marketing folks get about what they want to call it, people are going to find the movies they want to watch, and the movies they want to watch increasingly, and especially in this day and age as things are so horrifying in general, but I still want to go and get those thrills and chills is more and more important. I don't think we have to rehabilitate it. I view this book as not a way to rehabilitate the genre or sort of an apologia for it, but more of, hey, if you're interested in this, but you're a little too nervous about starting, let me help you. Like, let me be your friend who ushers you into this, because I really believe in I think a lot of people's first experience with horror is they weren't prepared for something really scary. Or I think a lot of us have had that experience of, your friend's older brother at a sleepover shows you a movie that's way, 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 way too scary for you, or they think it's funny to show you something that's too scary for you, right? And so it's sort of starting you in a place of bad faith with the genre. For me, I think it's really important to like extend a hand and invite people in with like kindness and understanding. You catch a lot more flies with honey than with vinegar.
I love what you're saying here about invitation, because I think I've been thinking a lot about the horror genre as inviting. And I really like that. I like the idea that what we can do is offer a community of people that are navigating the horrors of our world in some way together. Now, that's not always the case. There's individual joys of horror and all of that. I think my question for you is I think maybe I saw this. You posted something about a kind of call for the weenies, as it were. And I'm wondering if you've found people galvanized in some way around this idea that, like, it's okay to be scared and it's also okay to still like horror. Let's invite you in. It's cool. You're cool. We're all cool. Everybody's cool. Like, let's just find our way in. And here's one for the weenies. Did you mean this as a kind of a call out to those folks and a call in and saying, hey, like, come on, join us. It's okay.
Yeah, it's a big tent. There's room for everyone. I like it as a collaborative experience. When you go to a horror movie in a theater, you're having those emotional reactions and those gasps and those jump scares and that sort of laugh of relief after a particularly bad jump scare that, like, oh, that really got me. Did it get you? And it becomes a communal experience. And that's really wonderful. I went to see 28 Years Later in theaters, and not to get too, blue here, but the sort of ripple of laughter that went around the theater at the reveal of that one zombie with the huge genitalia, that's a great experience. You can't replicate that at home. And I like that sort of shared processing of stories. And I think doing that with someone and with someone who's non-threatening and who's sort of, there to help you have a good time is a great way to do this. But also, when I was telling people about this book before it came out, anytime I would post about it or talk about it to, people in person, I would get at least one or two people going, oh, that's for me. I need that. And it was so common. And it made me realize, like, oh, this is, in my little sort of genre bubble, my, the community I've formed of all these other beautiful horror weirdos. We kind of take it for granted that most people think like us. And it's just not true. I mean, some people are not into it because they didn't know where to start. Some people are not into it because of a bad experience. I had a very funny, very sweet experience actually at the Merrimack Halloween Book Festival in northern Massachusetts last year, where we set up. It's a book fair, and it's set up in a library, and we were, there for the duration. And as we were starting to get toward the end, maybe a half an hour before the event was wrapping up, this woman started wandering along the, row of booths where I was set up. And next to me, there was an indie press with some books for sale. And she had this sort of like increasingly upset look on her face as she wandered around. And she got to these guys next to me and she said, well, do you have any Christian books? And they very gently responded to her and said, oh, well, this is a book fair for horror authors, so not really, but you're welcome to take a look. And she kind of nodded and moved on to my booth. And then she looked at the title of the book and she went, oh, this is what I need. Actually, no, this is what my daughter needs, because she likes to watch horror movies when her husband's out of town and then call me and ask if she can come over because she's too scared. And so that kind of was like a proof of concept thing for me. It was like, okay, this can actually work. This can spark somebody's mind and go, oh, I had never considered that before. So yeah, I've been really happy and really gratified with that reaction from readers.
That's fantastic. I love that little story. So, you were talking about 28 Years Later, seeing that in theaters, and the alpha zombie thing, guys, member is something. It is something to remember. Unnecessary.
Is there room for horror for wieners as the next one? Is that not on?
Oh my God, I can't believe I didn't think of that. That's perfect.
Yeah, that wiener was a horror. I'm gonna just put that out there. That was the entire movie, just like every time, just like right in your face. Like, please, can we move the I mean, I don't think of myself as super prudish, but yeah, it's just like, that's yikes. Like, wow, like you could take an eye out. Anyway, so after 28 years later, this is probably where we ought to transition into some other things you've been watching perhaps, or reading, or any video games maybe you've been playing if you partake in video games that have brought you joy. Like what's on your list currently that you're enjoying?
Well, my friend Gretchen Felker Martin just showed me a real nasty movie from 2009. It's an Australian horror movie called The Loved Ones, which it had not even been on my radar. I don't know how I missed it, but it was a debut from this guy named Sean Byrne, and it's basically, they kind of build it as Pretty in Pink meets the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, about a teenage girl who gets turned down when she invites a classmate to a dance and takes brutal, bloody revenge in ungodly ways. And boy, did I have a good time with that. And as someone who, my main sort of horror mode is not necessarily that sort of like torture, bodily destruction stories. But I was having a lot of fun because it was just such an original twist on the woman getting tortured story. Aside from that, let's see, I just read Something in the Walls by Daisy Pierce, which is a folk horror novel that came out earlier this year about a woman who is a child psychologist in England in the late 80s and gets called. A journalist invites her along to report on the story of a teenage girl who may or may not be possessed by the witch that lives in her chimney. So a little bit Conjuring-y, but also very folk horror. There's like a big Wicker Man element in there. And I love folk horror. It really hits all my buttons. Gaming, I'm not much of a gamer, but I have been playing on and off for the past year, Cult of the Lamb, which is sort of gently spooky. It's I know cozy horror is like a controversial term now, but that's kind of exactly what it is. It's tongue in cheek, it's funny, but it's got really great aesthetics and atmosphere.
Yeah, all of that sounds really incredible. I've not heard of The Loved Ones. It does sound like you have to be in the mood, like you said, a vibe for that kind of thing. I love that Gretchen Felker Martin is offering these to you, a great author. And so that's just a fun thing to imagine you all watching that together. So, Emily, I want to say thank you so much for joining us, for taking the time, for writing something like this for a crowd of people that may have been forgotten or just not thought of at all. And so offering that invitation, which I think is such a joy that I've found in horror, and I appreciate that work that you've done. So thank you again for joining us.
Thank you guys so much. This was really wonderful, and I love talking about this stuff, so I really appreciate the opportunity.
This has been an episode of Horror Joy, produced in conjunction with Axis Mundi Media. Thanks for joining us. We want to hear from you. You can find us at Horror Joy Pod on Instagram or at Horror Joy Pod on YouTube. You can also email us at horrorjoypod@gmail.com, all one word. And you can, of course, find us wherever you get your podcasts. Give us a like, subscribe, leave a review. Until next time, remember, seek joy, even in horror.